My name is Emma Grant, and I was 32 when everything I trusted was taken from me. I remember the sound of the front door that morning, as if it were a verdict being read out loud. The lock clicked, the wood sighed, and the small hall clock in our apartment measured the seconds like a courtroom clock. I looked at the open folder on the kitchen table, and then at the photo on my phone of Dad smiling at my graduation. Then at the empty chair where he used to sit and drink bad coffee and complain about the Cubs. I had dust on my palms from moving boxes the week before. I had a bruise on my forearm from dropping a heavy crate. I had hoped that settling into the new life in Milwaukee would quiet the terrible noise in my head. But the noise came back with a new voice that morning. The voice belonged to Laura. My sister had a voice that could make a story sound like a fact. She had always been able to turn a room toward her without trying. She had always been the one adults smiled at first and remembered later. I used to think that was how she loved me. That belief was a warm blanket I held on to until she folded it and sold it. The folder had numbers in neat columns and a small sticky note that said, "Signed." My bank account was emptied. My credit cards were declined. My name was on the account, but not the money. I called my employer and they told me direct deposit had been rerouted the month before. They sounded apologetic and distant. I remember dialing my sister's number because in that moment I needed someone who might answer with a human voice. She did. Her voice was honeyed and calm. She said, "I thought you knew," and I said, "Knew what?" And she said everything, and I stared at the kitchen table and the mug with Dad's initials, and the memory of him folding laundry on the couch like it was a Sunday ritual I could replay forever. I had moved here with savings from a small inheritance Dad left, and from years of working late shifts at the clinic. I had made careful plans to buy the house in the old neighborhood, to pay off the loan, to fix the roof the way he wanted, and to take him to see the lake again the next June. Laura had promised to help when she could. She had promised a lot of things when it suited her to promise them. I had believed her because she was my sister, and because I was never good at imagining cruelty in people I loved. The truth was a legal paper and signatures and a forged power of attorney. She had used my name to take what I had earned and what Dad had left me. She had used a notary stamp and an old address and a smile to make strangers believe she had my consent. She had been careful. She had never been clumsy. In the week that followed, I learned the depth of her planning. There were emails she sent to herself from my account to make a paper trail. There were phone calls she recorded. There were witnesses she paid to sign statements about visits that never happened. There were tiny details she handled in the way a surgeon handles an incision. When I confronted her on a rainy Wednesday, the rain slicking glass across her cheeks like she had been crying. She said, "Emma, you are making this so small," and I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Dad needed someone, and you were self-absorbed, and I had to do what was best." And I remember standing in her apartment and feeling like I had fallen through the same floor I had stood on my whole life. Her living room smelled of coffee and a perfume I had never learned to hate until that moment. She had a new lease on life in a new city, 2 hours away with a steady salary and a husband who kept his own counsel. Her hands were steady when she lit a cigarette and slow when she folded her fingers into her lap. She told me she had loved Dad more than I had. She told me she had been there when he was dying while I was living my life and working shifts and paying bills. The words were all true in pieces. She had been there. She had not been there for him the way I had needed her to be there. She had not sat through late-night hospital vigils with me. She had not listened to the hospice nurse explain morphine dosages when I trembled at the thought of what it would do to him. She spoke like a person making a speech to a jury she planned to please. I left her apartment and walked home under the rain without an umbrella because I did not care if I got wet. The neighbor's dog barked at me from a stoop. I felt the bark as if it were the sound of a verdict. Over the next month, I lived in a fog of calls and letters and small indignities that felt like hunger. My friends came around at first, and then slowly the texts slowed to a trickle. People did not like getting dragged into legal snares. They did not like being reminded that families could have secret fissures. I slept in Dad's old sweater because it still stank faintly of him. I ate frozen dinners and made a ritual of stirring them slowly and thinking about the warmth Dad's hands had given me when he tied my shoelaces as a child. I met with lawyers who moved like glaciers, efficient and cold. They told me the power of attorney signed in my name looked legitimate on paper. They told me certain filings could not be undone unless evidence of fraud could be proved beyond a threshold. Evidence. I thought of every time Laura had called me in the middle of the night, asking for help with a problem, and I had dropped everything and gone. I thought of her smiling at family reunions, as if nothing could touch her. I wondered how someone could hold both versions of themselves without cracking. One night, I stood in the kitchen and I held Dad's old mug up, and the light cut a line through the rim like a promise. I promised myself that I would not become someone who tearfully begged strangers to fix my life. I promised myself that I would stand and look at the damage and map it like a territory I had to reclaim. I started keeping careful notes. I wrote down dates and times and every call and every text. The habit of recording small details in a notebook became the only thing that steadied me. I wrote in simple language so I could read it later without getting lost in emotion. I learned to recognize the way Laura bent facts until they matched the story she wanted to tell. Her talent for shaping stories had been what made people trust her. It was the same talent she used to shape the legal paper that stole my money. My sister's name was Laura Keene Grant, and she was 29, and she had always worn good shoes and expensive coats. She had married Cole when she was 28, and Cole liked cars and silence. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words landed like boulders. I met him once at a holiday dinner, and he smiled at me like he knew a joke only he could hear. Later, I found out that he had opened a bank account in his name and her name, and that they used it as a shell to route funds. He had been part of the planning without ever being the loud voice of it. He was the quiet accomplice, and he did not flinch when I said his name. He said, "Emma, it is complicated," and then he walked away. Complicated was his favorite word when he wanted to make the moral texture of his behavior soft. The legal battle took a little life from me each day. I felt my energy leaking like a faucet left on. I had to work at the clinic, and I worked late because patients did not care about my bank account. I learned to smile in the fluorescent light and not cry when a child with a broken arm clutched my hand. At night, I read the case law, and I watched my sister on social media posting photos of vacations and meals and friends. She had posted a picture of herself at a rooftop bar. Wine in hand, the caption a sigh about the little things that make life sweet. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall. Instead, I opened the notebook and wrote down the date and the caption and the location the rooftop bar used to advertise. I started to follow small threads and tie them into a net. The lawyer who had first told me the documents looked legitimate later found an inconsistency. There was a notary stamp from a small shop in the city that was a weak link because the notary had a known habit of not checking identification thoroughly. We subpoenaed their records. The clerk there had a memory for faces, and she said she remembered Laura looking nervous the day she signed the papers. She said she had been there for people who had been in emergency situations, and she had some notes about Laura's hands shaking. It was a small crack. We took it and we widened it. The thing about secrets is that they require constant maintenance. Lies are like sandbags that need steady placement to hold back a flood. If you tug at one corner, sometimes the whole shape shifts. I was not an avenging force. I was a woman who had been taught to keep receipts and to save for a rainy day, and who had once believed family meant you were safe from treachery. I did not want to hurt Laura. I wanted what she had taken. But in the way of complicated human things, my desire started to change shape. It turned into a hunger for truth, and then into something colder. I started to watch her patterns. She liked to use the same notary shops when she could. She used friends of friends who were willing to lie for a small fee. She kept a ledger of favors. I learned that by paying attention, I could follow the invisible trail of her life. I learned to be patient in the way a miner is patient when he waits for a seam to reveal itself. I told myself I was building a case. In those months, the small moments hummed like electrical currents through me. I noticed the way Laura folded a napkin in restaurants. I noticed the tension in her jaw when her husband laughed too loudly. I noticed the little scar on her knuckle where the skin had been scraped in a childhood bicycle accident. I turned sensory details into a map because the map felt like a thing I could hold and organize and eventually use. The day the subpoena brought in a new document that shook everything was ordinary in the way a storm sometimes is. I had been at the clinic and then at the legal office, and then I had stopped for coffee at a small shop on Brady Street. The clerk called me and said we had found a wire transfer record that matched a date and a time and an account. It was small at first, but then the wire trace led to a Jeffers Real Estate LLC, and that company held a mortgage on a house in Wauwatosa with both our names on it. My fingers shook when I read the printout. I thought of the old house with the sagging porch that Dad used to fix every spring. I thought of the idea that things we love can be written into paper and then taken apart at a signature. The real estate company had sent a fax to a number that matched a small office where Laura used to do volunteer paperwork. The volunteer coordinator remembered Laura coming by and speaking eloquently about helping shelters and veterans. The coordinator had warmth in her voice when she said Laura had been so sincere. The coordinator had no idea she was part of the chain now. With each new piece of evidence we pulled, the lawyers began to move with a heat that had been missing at the beginning. We filed motions and we called witnesses, and the court set dates. The process was slow and public, and every filing felt like a small attack and a small bomb at the same time. I felt the public nature of it like an exposure. People who had known me all my life asked questions and then pretended they had none. Rumors wrapped themselves around facts like ivy. Laura said I was meddling. She said lawyering was a way for me to relive the past and to punish her for living. She used the word living the way someone uses a shield. I had to remind myself that she had smiled when she signed the papers she used to take the money. She had not spoken about my living when she used the funds to pay for a new car. She had not asked me if it was right. She had decided. The hearing days were the worst. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched a woman I had once shared a bed with in childhood put on a face that looked both contrite and rehearsed. Her eyes flicked to mine a few times, and each time I felt as if she were trying to see what I would wear on the day we were each judged. The judge was a woman with a sharp voice and a habit of tapping her pen against the bench as if it were a metronome. She asked Laura simple questions about where she had been and when. Laura told them little stories about being there at Dad's side when the paperwork needed done because Emma was busy at the clinic, and the judge asked me if it was true. And I said yes, I was at the clinic, and I worked nights, and I drove to the hospital when I could. And I sat alone at the bench, and I held my dad's hand, and she listened, and the judge's pen tapped, and it felt like a metronome counting off the truth. Then the prosecution presented a string of records that could not be easily explained. There were travel receipts and cell phone pings that matched times that did not line up with Laura's testimony. There were bank transfers, and a handwriting expert testified that signatures on certain documents had irregularities consistent with forgery. The courtroom felt like a body that could both wound and heal. When the judge looked at Laura and said you had the power to act, and you acted in a way that the court finds to be fraudulent, the word fraudulent landed in me like a physical thing. And I felt both relief and the hollow resonance of a bell. Laura's face changed. It was the first time I saw a crack without any honey left behind. She had practiced regret like a character practicing lines. Now there was no honey to spread over it. She looked as if she had been peeled. She was asked to provide restitution, and the court froze some of the assets and placed liens. It was not the same as what had been lost, but it was a start. On the day the verdict came down and the judge ordered a partial return and a criminal investigation, there was a small riot of silence inside me. People who do not live through public betrayal cannot understand the way silence works. Silence is not peace. Silence is a waiting room full of mirrors. I left the courtroom and I walked to a diner nearby, and Bernard, the owner, who had always been kind to Dad, served me coffee without asking questions. A woman at the counter patted my shoulder as if to say, "We see you," and it felt like an absolution I did not deserve. Laura's husband, Cole, texted me a message that said, "This is a mess," and I replied with a note that said, "Tell her to say sorry," and he replied with a gif of a cat. When my lawyer told me to prepare for appeals, I felt the old faucet of my energy drip and then stop. I had come to a place where I wanted the paperwork to be over and the money to be returned, but part of me wanted something I could not properly name. I wanted to see the way her life shifted when she had to answer to what she had done. The phrase, "let karma do the rest," had been in the title I gave to the story. When I sat down in my notebook months earlier, the phrase felt true in the way weather feels true. I wanted natural consequence to be something that could be observed and not just a hope left at the altar of the universe. I continued to live my life plainly. I kept working and paying bills. I put in long hours, and I listened to patients tell me about their lives, and sometimes when they left, I felt like my own life was an island with a lighthouse and no boats. I wrote lists and checked items off. The world continued to turn like a well-oiled machine. Small things began to happen that looked like falling dominoes. A contractor Laura hired to redo a porch sent a message to a local Facebook group asking for a reference. Someone recognized his name, and tagged an old post about fraudulent invoices he had submitted to another job. And when the message caught fire, a journalist from a local paper called. The journalist was curious, and then the contractor withdrew his postings, and his business page went quiet. It felt like small birds leaving a tree. Then a tax audit found discrepancies in a small business account associated with Jeffers Real Estate LLC, and someone began to ask pointed questions about payments labeled as volunteer donations. The audit flagged transfers, and the bank froze some of the accounts while it investigated. It was a tedious process, and every new notice came with an added level of humiliation for Laura. I did not take pleasure in the day-to-day indignities, and yet when they arrived, I could not pretend they did not warm some cold place inside me. I told myself I was simply a witness to consequences rather than their architect. People began to look at Laura differently. Friends withdrew invitations with careful emails that cited busy schedules. A brunch date became a rumor of illness. The social fabric she had wrapped herself in frayed in small places and then larger ones. The man who had once looked at her as if he had the right to her future now avoided her at social functions and answered emails with clipped sentences. I overheard some of this through the grapevine, and I felt strange about being privy to the gossip. I was not immune to it. Each snub felt like a small healing. In the middle of all this, the harder legal problems made her life rearrange in ways I could not have engineered. Her credit score tanked, and a house she had been eyeing fell out of reach. She lost the lease on a studio she had used for art classes because the landlord said they wanted someone with cleaner financial records. It was a curious mixture of justice and randomness that made the world feel less kind to her by degrees. I had a moment late one evening when I walked past a small park near my apartment and saw Laura sitting on a bench with her head in her hands. I almost turned away because it felt like I was intruding on something private and haunting. And then something in me flickered and I sat across from her in the cold air. She looked up and the face she showed me then was not composed for an audience. Her mascara streaked under her eyes. Her lips were dry. She said, "Emma, I did what I had to do, and I said you had no right, and she said Dad needed someone to make decisions, and I said you made decisions that were not yours to make, and she said that I was trying to survive." And the words came in a rush like someone giving a confession. She talked about bills and phones and a man at the bar who had promised to help and then not helped, and about a childhood of being second in a family that always praised me for my grades. She said you always had the patience and the teacher's temperament, and she laughed like it was a thing with teeth. I listened, and there was a part of me that felt her confession soften the edges, and there was another part of me that held fast to the record of what she had done. Listening to her speak was an immersion in complicity and truth. She had not been born cruel. She had, like all of us, been shaped by small violences and overlooked needs. She used those as reasons, not excuses. I remember the light that night slicing through the bare branches like rulings, and the smell of damp earth and the distant sound of tires on wet asphalt. After she left, I sat on the bench and I thought of Dad telling stories about the seasons and how you could look at a field and predict the weather by the cloud shape. And I thought how wrong I had been about observation because I had never seen how one person could hide 100 motives in a smile. Months turned into a year and the audit completed, and the legal settlement returned a portion of the funds to me. It was not enough to restore all that was lost, but it was a number on paper and a small measure of vindication. The criminal case resulted in probation for a brief period and community service and a public apology that read, as if someone else had edited the pronouns. Those words alone did not calm the storm inside me. They were not the tidal wave of justice I had imagined in the middle of nights when I could not sleep. But life has a way of continuing. My name began to reappear on neighborhood lists and on small volunteer boards, and people who had been hesitant at first came back because they saw that a court had declared certain things that could no longer be easily disputed. I built a schedule around slow wins and small pleasures. I bought a new coffee mug with a chipped lip, and I started a small herb garden on my windowsill. The herbs lived stubbornly, and the basil smelled like summer. There were days when I would look at a photo of Laura at some party and feel a pinch like a stitch pulling. Then the unexpected happened. Laura lost her job. It was not the law that took it from her, but a set of things she had not predicted. A boss who had tolerated minor inconsistencies in the past decided that pattern of misconduct created risk. Laura had used expense accounts in ways that had raised questions, and the company decided it could not afford the controversy. The termination was swift and sharp. I watched the news of it through a friend's text message, and I felt a strange stillness, like the pause before an instrument strikes. She called me that night, and her voice was small and brittle, and she said, "Emma, I do not know what I will do." And I said, "You should have thought about that before you did what you did." And she said, "I know." And there was a long pause, in which the sound of her breathing felt like confession. She told me she was moving back to the city she had left, and that Cole had left too. And I felt a finality in the way she spoke, as if she were closing the lid on a box of things that could not be reopened. The pattern of small misfortunes accelerated like a cascade. Her car broke down, and a mechanic informed her she had been skimping on maintenance and needed repairs she could not afford. A student loan bill that had been deferred suddenly came due when the lender changed terms and collected interest that compounded in ways that made her eyes widen, like a person seeing a figure in the wrong place at night. The friend who had once smiled for her photos now answered with curt texts and then stopped returning calls. The house she had hoped to buy was sold out from under her when the seller accepted another offer, because they wanted a buyer with clearer finances. Each event seemed ordinary until you placed them together in a row and watched the pattern emerge. I could have been the architect of these events if I had wanted to be petty and cruel, but that was not who I was. I had my own bills to pay, and nights I cried into pillows no one would find. I told myself I was merely a witness. Yet in the privacy of my own mind, I allowed the thought that maybe, just maybe, the world had a way of balancing things without my intervention. The world might be neither moral nor immoral, but it could be tidy in its own mechanisms. This is what people mean when they say, "Let the world run its course." I had wanted someone to answer for what they did, and the system had done its piece. The rest was not mine to micromanage. The day that felt like the final movement came in a quiet, almost bureaucratic way. Laura had been running numbers and trying to reapply for jobs when she received notice that a company that had accepted a large lease from Jeffers Real Estate LLC was suing them for fraudulent representations. The litigation was public, and the paper printed it under a headline that cut through the small city gossip like a blade. The reporters named names, and the bank filings that had once been a web were now shown under the stark light of access and discovery. Evidence that had not been admissible in earlier hearings was now being aired. The company that had been paying for renovations and favors suddenly had to answer to shareholders and to a board who wanted a scapegoat. Laura's name was listed in documents that mentioned her as a contact and an organizer, and as someone who had presented documents. The pattern that had been held together by small lies came apart when it had to be defended in public. The public exposure stripped pretense from everything. Employees who had once pretended not to see things now had to speak. Partners who had once smiled in photographs now had to testify under oath. It was not an elegant fall. It was not cinematic in the way the movies stage humiliations with perfect pacing. It was the grinding of gears and the ringing of small bells and the opening of file drawers. But the result was decisive. The company lost contracts and found itself subject to fines and a management shakeup. Jeffers Real Estate LLC dissolved under the strain of lawsuits that pried open ledgers. The real estate shell that had held the mortgage on our house was declared a fraudulent entity, and auditors traced funds to accounts Laura had used to fund a lifestyle she had previously presented as modest. The bank froze accounts, and a judge ordered a full forensic audit. In court, the judge read findings that laid out a detailed web of accused misrepresentation, and the word misrepresentation seemed small until you heard it applied to years of doctored documents and unpaid invoices and false signatures. When the judge asked if any of the named parties had anything to say, Laura rose and she gave a statement in which she apologized, with a voice that sounded like someone reading from a script written for a tearful scene. Her voice cracked in places where the court transcript recorded it, and the judge listened and then imposed penalties. The penalties were financial and public and included community restitution and significant fines. It was the kind of fall that had practical consequences and social ones. I watched the press conference on a live stream in my kitchen, and the image of her on the screen looked shrunken. She was wearing a coat that had once been expensive, but now seemed to hang on her like a patchwork. She had a new haircut that made her face look younger and more exposed. She looked tired. The small people in her orbit had abandoned her. Her husband was gone, and many of her friends had shrunk back into private lives. That is what I had wanted at some level. It is a hard thing to confess that you want to see someone pay, and that the satisfaction of their collapse is a cold and sharp thing, like a coin dropped into a bowl. When the judge declared the findings and ordered the restitution and the fines, I felt a heavy exhale inside my chest. It was not triumph like bells and fireworks. It was a weight lifting. It was practical. It was a thing that had been moved from one side of a ledger to another. After the court ordered restitution, the funds began to be released, and little by little my accounts filled with money that had been my own all along. I thought the money would feel like vindication, but money is only paper and digits until you spend it. The real moment came later when I walked past a small art gallery and saw one of Laura's canvases for sale, with a tag that read, "Sale pending," and then "Sale cancelled." The gallery owner told me later he had been pressured by clients and had decided not to exhibit her work because of the controversy. The gallery owner was nervous and apologetic, but his actions carried weight in the world Laura had inhabited. She had scaled a life on appearances and small favors, and now those things were gone. People turned away from her like a tide dropping from a beach. The final act that felt like a closing of a circle happened on a gray Tuesday. I had gone to the post office to mail forms for a volunteer group, and there was a letter from a small claims court inside. It had nothing to do with the large litigation. It was petty and small, and yet it mattered, because it was the sum of minor betrayals adding up. A former roommate had sued Laura for unpaid bills, and another person had filed a complaint about a canceled contract. The petty claims multiplied like a rash. Laura had been forced to liquidate some personal assets and sell items she had once displayed on social media. I read about an online auction where someone had bought a lamp she had once used in a staged photo shoot. There was a comment thread under the post that said, "Karma is a mirror," and other comments that were meaner. I told myself not to read them, but the urge was like a thumb pressed against a bruise. Hours later, I answered the phone, and the voice on the other end was Laura's. She said, "Emma, can we talk?" And I said, "Yes, come by," and she came, and we sat on my couch, and she smelled like cigarettes and soap and fear. She looked smaller. She had lost weight, and there were hollows under her eyes. She said I did not plan for this, and I said, "Who plans for their life to be built on lies?" And she said I was trapped, and I said, "Trapped by what?" And she said by needing to be loved in certain ways, and respected for things I did not have. And she started to cry, and I felt a hard thing warm inside me. She put her head in her hands and she said, "I am so sorry," and I said, "Sorry is a word that can be used by people who have time." And she looked up and said, "I know," and I said, "You took everything," and she said, "I know." And then the most surprising thing happened. She asked me if I wanted my old house back, and I said, "There are legal things, you know," and she said, "I will sign whatever you need me to sign," and she said, "I will fight to give you back what I can." Her voice was not honeyed anymore. It was cracked and honest, and I felt the world tilt in a way I had not expected. I had wanted punishment, and I had imagined punishments that would make her feel the sting of what she had done. But what I had not imagined was an offering of restitution that came with a humility that looked like confession. She worked nights at a diner, and she took community service hours, and she apologized to people she had wronged, and the apologies were sometimes empty at first, and then they seemed to gather meaning like rain collects in a bowl. The last scene of our story is not a single moment of cinematic cruelty. It is quieter, and yet it stings like a perfect note. On a cold morning in late October, I met Laura at the bank to sign a document that would transfer a small portion of assets back to me. She arrived with a folder and a coat that had seen better days. Her hands shook when she passed me a coffee from the drive-thru, and then she sat and she held the folder like a talisman. She said, "Emma, I do not expect your forgiveness," and I said, "I do not know if I can give it." And she said, "I will work for what I owe," and I said, "That is all I want." The banker sat behind glass and stamped the papers with an official sound, and the stamps felt heavier than any sentence. When the transfers were complete, I felt something like closure, but not a cathedral of joy. There was no cheer and no band. There was a small, severe sense of order restored. Later that day, I drove to the bay and stood on the dock Dad had loved, and the water smelled of iron and cold, and the gulls had a small chorus that sounded like ordinary life. I felt the wind and the sun and the small ache of a wound that would heal into a scar. The scar would never disappear, and it would remind me of the shape of betrayal. I thought of Laura walking back to her car, and of the documents signed and stamped, and I thought of the way truth had been a slow, relentless force that had rewritten ledgers and made the world less hospitable to the sort of smooth deceit she had once relied upon. The final taste of it all came months later when I walked into a small cafe and a woman I did not know hesitated and then said, "Emma," and she reached out and squeezed my hand and said, "I'm so sorry for what happened," and I suppose she had read about it or heard about it, and I smiled in a way that was practiced and real. There was a clean ache in the center of me, and the knowledge that life had moved and that consequences had arrived, and that in the end, the people who had used the machinery of the world to hurt me had been found out and had to answer. The payoff was harsh, and it was practical. Laura had to rebuild from smaller things. Her friends were fewer, her husband was gone. She had to find work that paid less and to learn the small dignity of steady labor and the humiliation of starting over when the world keeps a ledger of your past. She learned, I think, to measure her actions differently. I was not fully happy, because happiness felt like a different planet. I was not vindictive, because cruelty was a dark mirror. I was someone who had been wounded and then listened to the sound of the wound closing. The last line in my notebook belonged to a sentence I had written the night Dad died. "I will not forgive myself for what I allowed." And then I had crossed it out and written, "I will not let this define the rest of my life." Standing on the dock, I watched the water and thought about how things erode, and then how they sometimes reveal what lies beneath. The harshness of what happened to Laura did not erase the pain of what she had done to me, but it placed it inside a world that had consequences, and that mattered. If there is a lesson, it is this. The world finds ways to balance books, and people who believe they can bend the ledger will eventually find they cannot hide forever. I left the dock and I walked home under a wide sky, and the air tasted like salt and freedom, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, a small peace settle into my bones.